On the Healthy Human Revolution podcast, Dr. Lori Marbas interviews nutrition and lifestyle medicine experts and extraordinary guests whose informative and inspiring stories will empower you with the knowledge to transform your life and health.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm Dr. Lori Marbas, and today I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Bruce Moon. How are you today?
I'm fine. A little bit warm here in northern Illinois, but other than that, things are good.
Excellent. Yeah, it's a little warm here in Colorado, above the norm for sure. So, well, the reason I have you on the podcast is I just find this so amazing is you are a former art therapist, but with decades and decades of information, written many articles and books, and you're an artist, a musician. I just found it rather intriguing reading about you. So I'm quite excited about this. And if anyone who knows my Instagram, I love to do art as well. And I'm tickled to be here. And thanks again for all your time for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Could you tell us a little bit about just your history and how you came into the field of art therapy?
Well, this could take the whole time. When I was an adolescent, I was sort of heading the wrong way in life, I think. And for me at that point, life revolved around athletics and rock and roll music, and I wasn't paying much attention to school. And a couple things happened. One was I broke my Achilles heel in a gym class, and broke it into 9 pieces, and that essentially ended my athletic career.
Wow.
my serious athletic career, anyway. And I was, for the first month, I was pretty much bedridden at home because it had also ruptured the tendon, and just in those days, things were not as advanced as they are medically now. And so I was kind of depressed. And I had this friend of mine, Iffy Adams, who was a wonderful painter. He was kind of acknowledged as the best artist in our high school. And at that point, I was one of the better guitar players. So Iffy came over to my house one afternoon and said, "I'll make you a deal. If you will teach me to play guitar, I'll teach you to draw." And so he'd come over to the house after school, and we'd spend an hour or so learning bar chords and such things, and then he'd teach me how to draw. And along the way with that, he said, you really need to take an art class from this art teacher that was in my high school. And I credit that man, his name was R.J. Cromer. I credit him with, in some ways, saving my life. He was able to take every other subject in school and relate it to art. And somehow I guess he saw something in me that just kind of twisted it a little bit. And I went from being a marginal C and D student to the honor roll, and eventually a 4-point student by my senior year. And I decided that I wanted to be R.J. Cromer when I grew up. So I went to undergraduate school for art education and made it basically all the way through. This was during the Vietnam War. And when it came to student teaching time, R.J. Cromer was a real free thinker. I mean, in his art class, you did whatever you wanted to do and explored what you wanted to explore, and he would help you with that. And so when it came to student teaching, my supervising teacher that I was assigned was, as luck would have it, the wife of a fighter pilot in the Air Force. And I was a pretty avid, conscientious objector to the war. And needless to say, she and I didn't exactly hit it off. I mean, she wanted everybody to raise their hand to go get a cup of water and that kind of stuff. It was just anathema to me in terms of what I thought art education was. So by the time I got done with that, I went, well, A, it's a miracle that she passed me. And B, if this is what art education is these days, I want nothing to do with it. So I was stuck with, okay, now I've done 4 years of art education. What am I going to do? and I had this friend of mine who was a youth minister in the Methodist Church, and he said, well, why don't you go to seminary? And I had nothing better to do. So, okay, I'll go to seminary and become a youth minister or a pastoral counselor or something. And along it, at the seminary that I went to was the Methodist Theological School in Ohio. And at that school, at that time, you had to meet with your academic advisor once every 2 weeks during the first year. And basically, are you sure you're doing the right thing? Do you really want to do this? And as luck would have it, my academic advisor was a psychiatrist, Dr. Dick Baumgartner, who worked part-time at the seminary and part-time at Harding Psychiatric Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. And so he'd start every session. He's kind of a little bit manic guy. He'd say, Brucers, what the hell are you doing here? And I don't know. I'm just trying to figure things out. And so he'd start every session that way. And about 6 months in to that first year, he said, Brucers, I got this guy you got to meet. His name's Don Jones, and he's doing this brand new thing called art therapy at the psychiatric hospital. And I thought, oh, okay, I'll put that in the back of my mind. Later that afternoon, I was working as an adolescent counselor in a community counseling service in Worthington, Ohio. And my boss came walking down the hallway to my office there with a newspaper article about this guy named Don Jones. And he said, Bruce, I think you should contact him. So, okay, twice in the same day, I can take a hint. So I called fully expecting to be given a secretary and make an appointment for God only knows when. But I got right into, I said, Don Jones, how can I help? And I said, well, so I told him a little bit of my story, and he said, well, let's get together for lunch tomorrow. So we got together for lunch, and he started telling me stories about his view of how art could help folks who were seriously disturbed. And by the end of that lunch, I was hooked. And so he said, well, why don't you go start knocking on doors and figure out a way to have your second year of seminary be as my apprentice? He was also a Methodist minister. In his past. So I started knocking on doors, and lo and behold, was able to convince the seminary that this is really what I need to do. Oh, and they said, okay. And so I spent a year as Don Jones' apprentice. I mean, I followed him everywhere. And it so happens that Don was one of the founders of the American Art Therapy Association and one of the first presidents of the association. And so I got introduced to all of the big names in the field, and never looked back. I mean, it was meant to be.
Wow. So that was quite an interesting journey, but it always seems like the universe was directing you towards this at different, it got you out of one thing and said, you will pay attention, and this is where you're going.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, very circuitous. Wow. That's really cool. It's fun to look, in the rearview mirror and see those kind of connections evolve. That's fantastic. So tell us a little bit about what is art therapy exactly. I mean, I think we can make some assumptions, but I think there's so many more intricacies to it that we're not aware of, or people who have never heard of it before.
Well, there are lots of different flavors, but when I try to talk about it with people, my clinical expertise was with children and adolescents who've been physically or sexually abused. And although I worked with adults also, but really that's where I think my heart lies most. And with the little kids, they didn't have vocabulary to explain what had happened to them and how they felt about it. And with the adolescents, they were so pissed off. The last thing they wanted to do was talk to an adult about what had been done to them by another adult. But in both cases, they had these feelings inside that were mucking up behavior at school, making family life miserable, and just generally running roughshod over their lives. So the work of art therapy is to how to take these things that are inside that either are unspeakable or or won't be spoken of, get them out into visual form and have the therapeutic benefit of somebody else in the world gets it. There's nothing more damaging, well, in my view, there's nothing more damaging to the human psyche than to feel as if you are the only person who ever felt this way and nobody else can possibly understand you, which, by the way, is sort of the adolescent stance in a lot of ways.
100%.
But the work of, if you put it out in a visual form and I'm able to engage with it poetically or artistically and again, convey the notion, I'm with you. I get it. I understand. And and these feelings are, you have every right to these feelings. And that's really where the therapeutic benefit comes from.
So you're validating them through their expression outside of the verbal language. So that means, because I have your book here too, The Introduction of Art Therapy and Faith in the Product. There were so many to choose. Your books, there's many to choose from, but I thought that one.
Oh, you see Don Jones there on the cover.
Is that Don Jones?
That's him in the background there, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I was wondering who that was because it was highlighted in the back too. And I read about Don Jones in here. And so, because you speak also in that, in your book about kids or people who have less verbal skills. I mean, to think about that, I mean, I know just my own job as, having patients and as a physician, if they don't verbally speak, you have to have a caretaker that is very intuitive to the patient's needs and what we can do for them. But can you tell me a little bit, how do you even get started with anybody, much less one that is not willing to convey the verbal component or the expression?
Laura, I think it's you're right on that the world is full of people who can't or won't talk about what they feel inside, but they still got feelings. So I mean, the last place that I did for about 10 years, I did pro bono work at an adolescent center for adolescent boys who committed a sexual offense of some kind.
Wow.
And it was not a nice place. I mean, it was a step above a prison, but not a very big step. And so these kids were always on guard and always, and as you might guess, the great majority of them were kids who'd been abused themselves. And so they acted out in a way that they knew. So kid comes into the studio, and I always try to be working on something when they come in. So I'm setting up this kind of what I call artistic contagion. Like they walk in the door and they see me engaged in doing this kind of thing. And the kid walks in the door and says, I'm not sure about language in this. F you, I don't want to be here.
Right.
And I said, that's perfect. The whole point of being here is to express yourself, and you just did. Now, how can we take that F you? If that F you was a line, what kind of line would it be? Would it be a nice, gentle line like this, or would it be a line like that? Well, duh. It's gonna be a really harsh line. I said, okay, well, I'll tell you what. If you think about that feeling, what color comes to mind? Black. All right. Let's start off by this painting by covering the entire painting black. We'll just do the whole. This is your background. We're just going to do the whole thing in black. And so what's happened then is I've become I'm working at becoming this kid's ally. I'm not going to crack on them for speaking in words that they're not supposed to use, and I'm going to honor that's the way you feel. Okay, so it's black, and plus now they're going to touch the paint. They're going to touch the paint to the canvas. They're going to feel how it spreads on the canvas. If they have white gesso showing through, all they have to do is go back and paint it some more. So they can't lose. They can't mess it up. I mean, how can you mess up painting something black? So we get this whole background covered in black. And then I said, okay, now back to that line. What, if we got this black background, what would be a great color to get into that FU, I don't want to be here? Red. Okay, all right, perfect. Let's make the line in red. So they do that. And I said, you know what would be really cool now is if we imagine a light shining on the top of that, we'll make some highlights. So they add pink or orange or whatever to imagine the light coming down on top of this line, and then maybe burgundy or purple or something on the bottom side where it's shadowed. And invariably then somebody will walk by and goes, wow, that looks really angry. And the kid goes, yeah, it is. and so the beauty of this is, even though they're expressing something that's really painful or ugly, it feels good to express it visually. I mean, it's a paradox that I may be working, the kid may be working with the ugliest, most hurtful thing in the world, but the expression of it, if it comes out clearly in the visual realm, that feels good to express what's bad. And then again, the therapeutic benefit of having me with them on the journey of that, and validating that it's okay. You have a right to feel this way.
Plus, I feel like the process of creation alone is therapeutic. I find that just really fascinating. So as you work with kids, do you see their art change? Like, what did you see? Was there anything that stood out as you went along? Did they find they got better also with the other therapy?
In the best of instances, their art gets more sophisticated. As they get more adept at expressing what it is they feel. Just like you don't speak English today the way that you did when you were 15. You've become more articulate. You've learned how to express yourself more clearly. And the same thing is true artistically. The more you do it, the better you get at it. And the more positive feedback you get from that, the better it feels to express yourself artistically. So yes, it would change, become a little bit more sophisticated. Now with little kids, not so much. I mean, there are developmental limitations with what they can physically and emotionally do. But even in that, as kids get more comfortable, they get more used to using the whole page or to expressing themselves bigger rather than tight little drawings.
That is amazing. So I can't imagine. I think you probably picked the most difficult population to work with.
Oh God, I love them though. They're so immediate. I mean, everything is, the world depends on what's happening right now. And there's something about that drama that probably my own adolescence still being played out.
Absolutely. So I can see that. So I know you've retired and some other things, but as you saw the field of art therapy evolve, in what context do you feel like that can be useful to the everyday person? Or is, like, how could someone who's not familiar with art therapy, because there's so much, in my own practice, you'll see people who are anxious and depressed and who suffered trauma as children, trauma as adults. How can we engage? Is there somewhere that we can refer patients to, or is there some type of process we could learn about how to work with patients or people can do on their own? Is there something like that available?
It's interesting. When I came into the profession in 1974, there were 300, about 300 of us nationwide as part of the American Art Therapy Association. Today, there are about 10,000. So that's been pretty remarkable growth over time, but we're still a baby compared to social work or psychology. I mean, a baby in terms of numbers compared to social work or psychology or psychiatry. The thing, if people are really interested, I would encourage people to connect with the American Art Therapy Association. They've got lots of good informational things on their website. What you asked about do-it-yourself sort of things is a little bit controversial.
I gathered that for reading articles. Yes.
Yeah, it's like I don't dabble in prescribing medications because I'm not trained in that.
Right.
And likewise, I think there is the art therapy profession itself these days is a master's level of entry. So there's a whole body of knowledge behind the work that Now, having said that, at the same time, we don't own art. I mean, art is there for anybody, and it can be therapeutic for anybody. But if somebody really wants to do therapy based on the art, then I think it's important to connect with people who have that discipline.
Absolutely. So to look for someone who is an art therapist, so they should look for someone who belongs to the association, or is there any credentialing that someone should be looking for? Because I imagine there can be some that claim to be, certified art therapists, and we really want someone who's going to connect with people and help them. So how would we know who that would be?
Well, there are there are several levels of credentialing. The first key one is to be a registered art therapist, ATR, with the American Art Therapy Association. Beyond that, there's a level of expertise and passing a certification exam that allows one to be a board certified registered art therapist. And then many states, Colorado being one, where of course one needs a license to practice, and there are some states that license art therapists directly, and there are many states where art therapists get licensed through the professional counselor licensure.
Oh, wow. Okay. Very
So
good.
all those things are important. Yeah, I mean, you buyer beware. I mean, you want to. Every now and then I see, I won't mention names, I see things online and I just go, oh my goodness, of people who are proponing to presenting themselves as if they are therapists or have some kind of knowledge, and that scares me. But
yeah, medicine's not immune to people representing themselves inappropriately.
yeah, right. You said it much nicer than I did. Thank you.
You're politically correct these days. So, that's great. I love hearing that story of the young man. Was there any other stories that kind of stand out to you over the decades that you worked with people that, just so that we could kind of learn to resonate with? Or
no, boy,
so
Laura,
many?
there are so many. We could be here till 10 o'clock tonight doing this. There was, and I've talked about adolescents. Let me talk about a geriatric person that I worked with. Her name, I'll call her Lenore, and she came into the psychiatric hospital terribly depressed. In the last year of her life prior to coming into the hospital, she had lost her husband, and 3 of her closest friends had passed away, and she found her and her children had all moved to other states. So she was really a lonely, hurt woman. And she would come into the studio and often would say, oh, I don't want to do anything. I'll just watch. And so I keep prodding and trying to find different ways to engage with her. And then one day, sometimes you just have to get out of the way. One day she picked up this ball of clay and just started touching it and working with it. And she ended up over the course of 2 days forming this open shell like piece that about that big, and in the middle of it had this just a round sphere. And I said, oh God, Lenore, that looks so much like an oyster. And she said, what? I said, right, the story how oysters get made? No. Well, you see, an oyster gets a piece of sand caught in their soft inner tissue, and it hurts. And so they squirt it with this creative juice they have, and for a while it feels better. But then that gets hard and it hurts again. So they squirt it again. And they keep doing this over and over and over again until we're left with a pearl. And so you see what was beautiful, what was really hurtful and ugly becomes something beautiful. And she looked at me and said, is that the truth? And I said, well, I don't know, but I believe it's a great metaphor. And she went, that's what this is.
Oh.
And so again, there are so many stories like that of people who I mean, the key thing is that folks who really couldn't or wouldn't talk about what their inner experience was, but still had all these images inside. And, truly, if you think about it, well, particularly with people with trauma. I mean, I've worked with veterans, a number of veterans who have severe trauma, and when somebody is experiencing a horrific experience, we know now that the part of the brain that records in words shuts down, but images just keep on coming, So if you're going to really reach the depths of trauma, I think you've got to work at least first with the images of that trauma in a safe way, and then maybe words come later. I worked with a man named, well, I won't tell you what his name is yet. He came into the hospital and was electively mute, and had been a Vietnam veteran, and had been homeless for years, and somehow ended up coming into the hospital. And we worked side by side in the studio for, I wanted maybe 6 weeks, without him saying a word. Just he'd come in, get to work. I'd paint beside him. He'd do whatever he was doing. And finally, after about 6 weeks, he turned to me and he said, "My name's David."
Oh.
He's like, I didn't know you could talk.
Wow. Wow.
But it's the providing a safe environment where people can be and do what they need to do without the intense pressure to somehow put it into words, which then constricts it or
Put it in a box, sort of.
Yeah, puts it in a box.
That's incredible. So as you're going through, I want to know what's going in your mind as you're sitting and either listening to people or watching their work. What is going through your mind? Are you formulating like, what's the next step? What could it mean? You're asking, like, how does a therapist start thinking in this process? Because I'm sure, because everything must be such a surprise, because creation can be so broad.
Yeah. There was a time in my career where I tried to think in terms of strategy. And the longer I was in the work, the more and more I let go of that and tried to really just focus on be here, be with this person, and to trust that. Something Don Jones always said, but the art never lies. And that if I could just be with it and look at it, think about it, and try to respond artistically myself or poetically about it, rather than get. I never something in the field, controversy in the field from years ago was, should we interpret images or not? And I guess I always took the stance as, you know what, the only interpretation that makes any sense is what the client says this is about. And my fantasy about what it might be about, that's not going to help them, but what they say. And so the work was really about radically trying to be with. When I was doing my doctorate, I got a chance to work with Clark from Stockus. I don't know if you know that name, but he was one of those guys who was a psychiatrist in the days of Fritz Perls and Moreno, and he knew Frankl, Viktor Frankl, and all those guys, all those kind amazing. Of the Mount Rushmore of therapy, and Clark, when I worked with him, he was probably in his early 80s. He was certainly well up there, and he just would always say, the most important thing you can do is learn to be with. So I worked hard at learning how to be with, trying to be with.
Well, I tell you, I think that's a lesson every single human being needs to learn. be present and mindful where you are. And I think, like our gadgets are really getting into the way of that these days for sure, which I don't think anyone would argue with.
Yeah,
So
our gadgets and our politics. I mean,
oh,
it's really hard to just really listen to somebody, even when they're saying something that you don't like.
exactly, because you've already created the judgment that
Right.
it's not worthy of your time. And so, or your thoughts or appreciation or openness, it is really quite a tragedy for sure, 100%. But as you're walking through all of these journeys with these patients and clients, how does this change you as a person? Does it change your art? Because I know you do music. So tell me, like, what do you as a person, what is different about you? Just like I'm different, like you mentioned my speech from 15.
Yeah,
I'd say so. What's different about you now?
I was really lucky on that. My first day as Don Jones' apprentice was September 16th, 1974. And on that day, I walked in and he said, "Do you have a sketchbook with you?"
Mm,
And in my naivete, I thought he'd want me to write down my wonderful clinical observations, or whatever. And I said something to that effect to him, and he said, "No, I want you to write poetry and do drawings about what you experience with these people."
oh,
So on that very first day, the tone was set for me about don't overthink this. Be an artist and respond artistically. And one of the in our field and in all mental health fields, I suppose, that people talk about burnout and being vicarious traumatization and stuff. And honest to goodness, I just never experienced that. And it was because I always used the experiences of being with clients as the source for my own painting, for my own poetry, for my own songwriting and performing, and so it's like it is an incredible thing to sit across the table from a young, say, a 14-year-old girl who's been sexually abused and has images about that she's working with. It can be incredibly painful, but you can't. I couldn't just keep taking that in without doing something with it myself. So so those experiences became the source of my own artwork in whatever media or mode I was working in at a time. And so I never came close to feeling burned out. It was always energizing in a weird sort of way I felt like clients used to be patients now, and clients were giving me gifts of their honesty and their pain and their suffering. And it was my job to then honor that and to give it back to the world in a different form.
I think that's wonderful. One of my favorite things is my sketchbook. So I have several of them. I think also too, because, I have 3 grown kids, one's a physician as well. And there was a quote, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was basically that a life, we all live these lives and we just want to have them kind of remembered in a sense. But I think what a wonderful way to do that is to share it in sketches and poetry and, just sharing that type of, and they don't have to even be good. They just, in the sense of, putting on a gallery wall, but these are meaningful to you and the people who know you and love you. So I think I just enjoy it so much. It really helps me just process the day too. It's like it down.
Right. Absolutely.
Because as a therapist, you will understand too, just from as a physician, from a family physician at that, we're kind of on the front end of care, and so we get told a lot of things, and they didn't prepare us for that in medical school. The sense of, oh, by the way, you're going to have to be a therapist in many cases. I'm just glad I had a little life before I was a doctor. But I think that's so important. And there's so many physicians who are dealing with burnout. We have the highest rate of suicide of any profession. And it's really disturbing to see such wonderful souls just at the wit's end. But I think a lot of them were never taught the outlet, like the creative element of your profession gives you that those tools to do that. Whereas, you know, as a physician, it's very much like the military. It's very restrictive, very, well, it's getting a little better, but not a whole lot. Very, you know, patriarchal and rules, and you're the tough and stoic and you will deal with it. And we're humans, we just can't do that consistently. And so I think there should be an art therapist with every medical school just for physicians or medical students.
Was one of the things I used to love at Harding Psychiatric Hospital in Columbus, where I was there for 22 years, and it was a teaching hospital. So there would be psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers and art therapists all the time coming through, and we'd always do these trainings in it. And it was the thing that I loved was when somebody would say, you know what you do reminds me that's a human being connected to the diagnosis. And I think particularly in psychiatry, we can get caught up in the omnipotence of, if I can diagnose it, then I can cure it. And but you know what? Unless you touch the person, I'm not sure the medication's going to help all that much. Just my 2 cents.
No, I think that's exactly right, because especially as you go further into the specializations, you know, so family medicine is the basic, internal medicine, OB-GYN, but as you go into further specialization, you think of them as an eye, or as they're a diabetic. And I think one of the things that I've learned over 20 plus years being a doctor is just walking patients through that you're not your disease. You are you who happens to have or happens to this. And I think they feel like a relief that they don't, you know, that they're not burdened by, this is me now. It's like, no, not at all. And what I do is I do lifestyle medicine, which is helping people find healthy ways of reversing or improving dramatically their chronic state of health, illness like diabetes, hypertension, arthritis, headache, all of that. And that honestly has been the most rewarding, is just helping people truly heal. And you create such a unique connections with people when they see you as guiding them, kind of like yourself, just helping them make better decisions, but you're just helping them express themselves in a way that they don't feel vulnerable. It's less vulnerable, I guess, or safe, I guess is the word. But that's really cool. Wow. So as far as your music, I do want to say, because you have a really cool YouTube page, and when I was playing it, my son, my middle one, Jonathan, he's 25, he just launched his own tea company, so he's at home because he's like, it's cheaper, Mom. Like, whatever, I enjoy having him around. And he goes, wow, that sounds really good. I was like, I know, that's who I'm interviewing. He's like, wow. So you're quite talented, and I just would love to hear a little bit about, I know it started with that broken foot and Achilles injury. Where is that taking you? And I know you've done quite a bit of shows and some other things. Where can people connect with that?
Yeah, well, when I retired from Mount Mary University and from academia in art therapy, I thought, well, okay, I've always been a performer and always been a songwriter, but it was always on the side burner, maybe not the back burner, but the side burner at least. And so this freed me up to really invest the time and energy. And lo and behold, what I have found is that I'm using my own art at this point in songwriting and performing to build community, to form meaningful relationships with this cadre of other musicians that I've kind of come across. I'll tell you this real quick little story. One night I play in dive bars and restaurants, and every now and then do some college gigs, which are a lot of fun. But I was in this bar in Libertyville, Illinois, and I sang. The places I play, they're used to having cover bands, and
okay.
I'm not very interested in that, and I don't want to do that. So I'm playing my own music, and I played this song about David, the Vietnam veteran that I told you about earlier, and I finished the song, and this guy who has since become my lead guitar player, who is he's 6'4",
Oh, wow.
270-pound, tattooed, Harley riding Vietnam veteran himself. Came up to me with tears just running down his face at the end of the song. And the closing line of the song is, "My name is David. My name is David." And at the end of the bar, 3 guys got off their bar stools and stood up and saluted. And all of a sudden, something very different is happening in that bar. And people were talking about why that hit them in that way. And I went, you know what? I'm doing the same thing I've always been doing, just with a different media. And since that time, I've been part of this community of, there are maybe 20 now musicians who we're together at least 2 nights a week in various and sundry places playing, and it's community, and it's important relationships and meaningful relationships. And I tell people, at this point in my life, I want my life to be one long art piece. And that's what I'm striving for. And then actually this weekend on Friday, I fly to Syracuse, New York to do a concert I've written about clients and called Notes from the Studio for the art therapy program at Syracuse.
Oh, wow. That is so cool. I wish I was in New York. If you ever come to Colorado, please let me know. I'll come see you.
Get Naropa to invite me out again. I've been to Naropa several times over the years.
Oh, really?
Right.
Okay, awesome. Well, there's lots of places that would be open what you do, your continuous art project with open arms, for sure.
I'll go any place that people will listen.
Yes, absolutely. Fantastic. My mind just goes, like, when I get to connect with people, like I read a book called How to Make a Plant Love You. And it was written by this young woman who's a model, no less, absolutely drop dead gorgeous. Her name is Summer Rain Oaks in New York. But she studied, it wasn't botany, but it was ecology and things in college. And she, in her little tiny Manhattan apartment, I think she had, last time I heard, 1,500 plants growing and all of these things. But as she was talking, she wrote a book, and I'm thinking, I kind of just came across her Instagram and found it really intriguing because I love plants, as you can kind of tell back here. But what was interesting, though, she would, in her book, besides giving you like how to water a plant and how to create whatever, she would say all these people that would write into her saying how they were depressed and how they were anxious, and then caring for something that didn't, judge them, that was always present, that required them to get out of bed, to care for them. They developed a relationship with these living beings, these leaves and these flowers were calling them to come and care for them, and brought them into the natural world. And she just wrote these really cool things. And she happened to mention this horticultural therapist. I'm like, there's a thing called horticultural therapy.
Yes.
Have I been living under a rock? Like, I thought I should have known this. And I'm just like, my goodness, this is like, my daughter, she's a family medicine resident in Boston. I'm like, I'm telling her all this, like, Em, you got to use all of these tools. There's so many cool things. She's like, Mom, you are over the top. But I just think, what a wonderful tool. And so I found him, I hunted him down and interviewed him. It was such a fun thing to talk about, and how people would, using the dirt and stroke victims and all the things they did. I was like, oh my goodness. But I just find it so fascinating to use these other elements in nature and creative components. And I'm just so intrigued.
Well, it's no accident, the old truism, actions speak louder than words. And I'm really glad you said that about the horticulture. Again, Harding Psychiatric Hospital, where I worked for 22 years, we had horticulture therapists, drama therapists, poetry therapists, occupational therapists, general activity therapists, people who did work therapy. And I used to participate in a group called log sawing, which is exactly what it sounded like. We used old 2-man crosscut saws to cut these big old huge stumps of hickory that came down from the
Wow.
hospital forest. And you can't imagine, you could take an angry kid out there and say, hey, I don't care how you feel, we got work to do. And just well,
Wow.
and then the incredible moment when it falls apart, and
Uh,
and the two of you have done that together. I mean, there's just incredible stuff
wow.
about all those different modes of expression, modes of being with other people.
Mhm.
We had a really talented guy who was an automotive therapist, and
Wow.
he just worked on old cars in the garage, and kids would come in, or people would come in and learn how to change oil, and learn how to
Mm.
work on the brakes, that kind of stuff, that mastery of doing rather
Right.
than all the time talking.
Right.
And,
No, I think
and then
that's
at the
great.
same time, you're building a relationship. I mean, you think about it,
Yes.
little kids, well, you've had children, so you remember teaching them how to tie their shoes,
Oh my goodness.
and
Yes.
that moment when they go, I got it. And that kind of connection between you and this child as they're mastering something in the world.
Mm.
I think there's a metaphoric thing there for all of us, that is about relationships come from what we do together, not necessarily from what we say to one.
Right. I think I could talk to you every day. This is great. You're good. I
Mm.
think I'll call you. It reminds me of a story. So I have three really bright kids. They're 27, 25, and 23. But Jonathan was born with, I developed hypothyroidism when I was pregnant with him. And he ended up being born hypothyroid. And then he had 2 weeks later, it was normal. But he developed my other two, Emily was doing her name by two. I mean, this kid, I'm like, oh, parenting is easy. Then I had Jonathan, and I was like, you could talk to him, he's fine, he's bright, but he couldn't learn his alphabet and he really struggled. And he ended up having really severe dyslexia. And, I spent a lot of time. I started medical school when they were 5, 3, and 10 months old. So I became a very good at time management and looking at things I'm a problem solver. Your mom, that's what you do. But what's interesting though, the traditional, A, B, C, and I was, talking to speech therapists and occupational, I was like, what is wrong with him? We didn't have a diagnosis till he was in kindergarten. He had been through preschool where they did the ABCs by Christmas of his kindergarten year, and we had held him back a year. He only knew 4 letters. Well, someone mentioned to me, because I was in medical school, so of course I had resources at my fingertips that most parents don't, thank goodness. And I said, what, I'm talking to everybody who could possibly help. And they're like, Lori, it sounds like dyslexia. Maybe you should look into that. And I was like, I just need a name of something. I don't know how to treat it. And I read a book called The Gift of Dyslexia. And I'll tell you, that book had many, many things. But one of it was what is like reading about Jonathan. But the other thing was he used tactile learning. So they used clay to help kids learn with dyslexia how to create the letters. And we learned 16 letters in 2 weeks over Christmas break. And it really shifted my mind and thinking outside the box when it comes to that relationship. But Jonathan and I are very, very close now because as he continued to grow and evolve and, just mastered reading and went on to do very successful and finish college and all that good stuff. But you're exactly right. It's that relationship, but it's also the creation. There's just so many amazing, cool things to come with that. The gift of dyslexia, that was like become like the gift of art. I just truly believe that's the case. Actually, a patient drew this one for me, painted. It's a watermelon and blueberry and strawberry.
Yeah.
Because I only eat a plant-based diet and I use a lot of vegetables with patients. But yeah, it's just that's amazing. So I really want to thank you for being you and your generation just really, working with patients, and I'm sure you've saved a lot of lives.
Well, yeah, thank you. Well, that's very kind of you to say. Unfortunately, I think that so much of that knowledge is sort of being lost,
Hmm.
and it's because of managed healthcare. I mean, when I started at Harding Hospital, the average length stay was a little bit over 190 days.
Wow.
the day that I left Harding Hospital in August of 1996, the average length of stay was 6 days.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
And that's all the effect of managed care. And to me, it's terribly sad. And that, so now I get calls every now and then. Would I consult with somebody because they've heard this thing about activity therapy? It's like, oh, come on, we were doing this 40 years ago. And
Right.
so and places are reinventing the wheel. And but it is what it is, I guess. That's the
Is there places, I'm assuming, that have outpatient art therapists and, maybe a community outreach?
yeah. I mean, having said that kind of morose thing about length of stay, when managed care came in the mid 90s, there was a lot of worry that the sky was falling and somehow professions like ours would be squeezed out. And in fact, what happened is that it squeezed us out into other venues. So today there are therapists working in hospice care. There are therapists in prisons. There are therapists in public school systems. There are therapists in geriatric centers. There are therapists doing private practice. So there, again, when I came into the field, 90% of us were in psychiatric, either private or state-run psychiatric institutions. Today, anywhere where human well-being is the focus, there's an art therapist someplace doing that.
Oh, wow. So in a sense, it's almost like a silver lining to the thundercloud.
It's the bright side of that cloud.
Because we had started a telehealth company, my business partner and I, right at the onset of COVID, unbeknownst to us. We're thinking, because it's all about helping people find healthier habits to, like I say, get healthier. And it's been very successful, but we had the bright silver lining of COVID was that I had doctors who wanted to partake, and then patients were not afraid of telemedicine anymore because of this devastating pandemic. So that was, I just find it, I believe God put it in our path. We just, with lining it, I don't believe in coincidence. I think there's true meaning for everything. So
I still wish there were places, safe places for people to be for longer term stays. I mean, granted, we managed to close down state hospitals, and some of them probably needed to be closed down, but we created a whole generation of the homeless and people who are without services. So
I mean, and it's as a vet myself, I spent 4 years in the Air Force and deployed overseas, and heard and saw things that I don't want to. I mean, wasn't even a place that was like, really scary, but I certainly took care of patients and was briefly in places I saw stuff. But, if the military, the federal government can't even take care of our vets, there's homeless vets. I mean, what hope is there for the private citizen who has some mental health issues, who's struggling with a high insurance deductible? And so I am, and I tend to be very conservative financially, but I am all about having at least a basic social medicine security for patients, mental health, especially because it's such a severe problem in our country. And it's so undertreated. It's a big problem. There's so much we could do to improve our medical system. I could speak for hours about that.
I'm very impressed by Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka, athletes who have come out and said, I can't do this anymore. They're too much. There are other things that are more important in my life than dealing with all this stress. So.
Absolutely. I 100%. And what's really hopeful is the reception. Of course, there were all the people who gave Simone Biles the issues and like, she's representing her. It's like, no, actually, she's representing herself. She just happens to be representing America, but she's the one that's carrying that torch, and we should support her in whatever way we can. But yeah, I mean, those young women, they are incredible. Absolutely. So, wow, amazing. So First of all, thank you again. I know I'm coming up on the hour, so I don't only keep you for an hour. But could you give us an idea of where we can listen to you? I know you have the Syracuse, New York thing coming up this weekend, and we'll be posting this on Monday. Where should we find you on? Is it YouTube, or do you have other? I know I've read about albums and things. I know you have plenty of books.
Yeah. Well, there are 12 books if you don't count second and third editions. But yes, I have a YouTube channel. You can just go on YouTube and type in Bruce L. Moon, and you'll take you there, and you can waste an afternoon listening to that stuff. I have a website, but I can't tell you the address of it off the top of my head. So.
Well, I will find it, and we will put it in the show notes as well. So this will go out to everybody. And I'm super excited for the reception. I love getting the comments that people leave on our YouTube channel. It's called Healthy Human Revolution, everyone. Don't forget to, and you'll see the links in the show notes. And we're super excited to, I'm hoping this will spark some, who knows, maybe there's some future art therapists that are listening somewhere. So really appreciate everything in your time. I will call you Bruce, but Dr. Moon as well. Thank you for your time.
It was a pleasure. It's a pleasure, Dr. Laura.
Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed that video. Before you go, though, please hit the subscribe button and the alert button so you will be notified whenever we upload any new videos. On Monday, we upload the Healthy Human Revolution podcast. Now, if you'd rather listen to the podcast, you can find it on all the major platforms, such as iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, and even Spotify. On Tuesdays, we upload the Doctor's In. This is where I answer your questions. Thinking of that, could you please comment below any questions you might have about health or wellness, or any topics that you would like me to cover? Now, if you're looking for more resources on how to start a plant-based diet, sustain a plant-based diet, exercise, recipes, anything regarding wellness, we've got you covered. Check out healthyhumanrevolution.com. And again, thanks for watching.